guy has like cauliflower ears are dripping compared to the older one when they're all so beautiful. Well, I guess we're gonna start.
Think so?
Yeah.
Okay. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this lecture. I know it's getting late. It's Sunday. Everybody want to go and take a nap or go and spar with their friends before they leave. So, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down here with us today to hear me lather about sociology. So, my name is Maxime Chouinard. So I've been practicing various forms of HEMA since 2002. Of course, in 2002, what I thought was HEMA has nothing to do with what I think is HEMA today. So, by the way, I say HEMA, I don't mean Eastern martial arts, it's just that I'm French, so I don't pronounce the H. So it's HEMA, right? Now, I have a bachelor's degree in archaeology. I have a master in cultural heritage. My thesis was done on martial arts as cultural heritage, and some of the questions I'm going to present to you today I explored during this thesis. And I'm also planning on a PhD in history, probably on Irish stick fighting. So, I also work as a museum curator at the Museum of Healthcare in Kingston, Ontario. So I happen to work a little bit in the historical field as a daily occupation. So, and if you wonder what kind of HEMA I do, I mostly do 19th century HEMA. So I practice saber, mostly French saber, also 19th century combative, self-defense, pugilism, Irish stick, cane, lacan. So 19th century is really my stuff. A little bit 18th century, but mostly 19th century. So today, what I wanted to do is to kind of start a discussion. So about the nature of HEMA. What are the concepts behind its practice? So not HEMA as in what were the people doing in the 16th century, but what are we doing today? What are we doing with this today? So how it relates, of course, to ancient and modern society, and what it can tell us about where we're headed. So why did I call this presentation what HEMA isn't? Right? Why would I call this what HEMA is? Right? Well, because it's a tough question to answer, and because there's many sociologists who say that for people it's way easier when you're discussing identity to define what something isn't than what something is. If I throw the concept of American forward, so if I ask somebody, ask Chris, what's an American? He's going to have his own ideas about this. So if I ask Mike, what's an American? He's going to have his own ideas about this. There's some very practical ideas, well, we live in the USA, but some people are going to say, well, America is actually a continent. Right? So, but if I say what isn't an American, then, you say, well, it's not this, not that. So, it can be easier to sometimes define things in the negative. So, now, first aspect I'd like to examine is one of the central concepts behind HEMA is, of course, what is a martial art. So let's just first examine where the idea of martial art comes from, or where the term actually originates from. So many people don't realize that martial art actually had a relatively different meaning in the past. Actually before the 20th century, and as far as I know, probably the term starts to be used commonly in the 16th century, and it's used to mean something very different, or at least much more large than what we're using it for today. Martial arts was a term that actually encompassed not only fighting, learning how to fight, but also strategy, siege warfare, horsemanship. So all the arts that were necessarily to make a warrior. So these were the martial arts. And fencing, wrestling was a martial art. It wasn't just these types that were martial arts. So sometimes actually people also use the term the arts, not the arts of Mars, but the arts of Sol. Sol was seen as a patron of soldiers, so sometimes it wasn't always Mars that was used, but sometimes Sol. So where does the term start to have its modern meaning? Well, so martial art was used, as I say, at least in the 16th century, but it comes up very rarely in documentation. People use it kind of as a fancy term in a way. They use it like to say, oh, the martial art. It comes a lot in poems, but very rarely in very practical documentation. It's really in 1912 that the change really occurs. It's because of a writer named Ernest John Harrison, who publishes The Fighting Arts of Japan, of course. So Harrison went to Japan, studied a little bit the martial arts over there, and he was looking for a translation of Bujutsu. So Bujutsu, if you translate it literally, it's more or less arts of war. So he said, well, how can I translate this and make this intelligible to people in the West? So he took martial arts and said, well, it's pretty much the same thing, so let's use that. But because his book was mainly about individual combat forms, people started to use martial arts to mean what we consider martial arts today, so individual forms of fighting. And by the 1960s and 70s, with the full-on karate and the kung fu craze, the phrase martial art will really enter the public imagination. And if you're in many dictionaries today, a lot of them will say, what's a martial art? Well, it's a fighting art from Asia. They won't even consider Western martial arts to be a martial art. So don't use dictionaries too much. So many authors have tried to define what a martial art is. And some argue that the term could only be really associated with arts meant for a warrior elite. So either soldiers, knights, samurai, whichever you can think about. And if it wasn't meant to teach them how to fight on a battlefield or in a duel, then it would be a fighting art. That's their view of it. It's not shared by everyone. Some people, like Thomas Green, rather say that martial arts are systems blending the physical with other components like strategy or philosophy. So you can see that some people have a way more larger look on what really constitutes a martial art. Some people don't like definition at all, so some people really don't use it and prefer to use more popular terminology. But of course, like many things, it's again easier to say what isn't a martial art than what it is. So let's look at something that's usually put in comparison. So what is a combat sport? So I want to ask a question to you guys. What is a combat sport to you? Sorry?
Boxing.
Boxing, yeah. What makes a combat sport?
Rules.
Rules, yeah, sure.
When people are trying to fight, but not trying to really hurt each other, so that one can be the win.
Okay, cool. Anybody else?
Any form of conflict between the two parties?
Okay, so any type of fighting between two people would be a sport, combat sport?
Yes, so like chess, combat sport, keep in mind.
Okay, true, yeah. So now let's look at the origin of the concept of sport. So sport, it's hard to believe, but the concept of sport actually didn't exist before the 17th century. It comes from de sport, which is a French term which meant to have, basically to have pleasure, fun. but it took a very different meaning once the British started to use it as sport. So in the 17th century, and this is according to Norbert Elias, who wrote a lot about the sociology and the history of sport. I recommend really reading his books. They're really enjoyable, and he really delves into issues of violence and sport, things that are really relevant to us today. And he was one of the first authors to really analyze this phenomenon, and its development was, according to him, tightly linked to the rise of democratic institutions and thought. So we'll talk a little bit more about this theory later. But so sports were developed because there were certain public institutions like parliamentary democracy that were beginning to take more importance, and this influenced not only politics but society as a whole. And people started to see that, well, if you can manage power and politics with rules and by making kind of a bureaucratization of the whole system, well, maybe we can apply this to other things. Maybe we can apply this to games. So people started to come up with sports. So until that point, there had been games, of course, like football and all of its derivatives. But football had been, I'm sure you've heard the story before, had been banned several times in the past, namely in the medieval times. And if you're not really aware of what football looked like back then, you might think it's silly. Like, why would you ban some guys, like some kids playing ball and on a field? Like, that's silly, right? Well, no, if we consider what football actually looked like back then, it actually makes sense that you would want to ban this thing, because believe it or not, but people were dying in football games, not even in big tournaments, but in friendly games. So people had a very different view of what was fun before today. And so you could, so they weren't a single, it's very hard to say what was football, because at a certain point, for example, rugby and football, or soccer as we call it today, used to be the same thing. And they split up at one point. So if you try to bring the two together and add punches and kicks, maybe you'll get an idea of what it could be. So the rules were very flexible. They were not implemented in the same way. There was no football federation or training referees or establishing rules. And breaking a rule was not seen in the same way as it is today, meaning that if I break a rule today in football, they'll give me a penalty, they'll bring me out of the game, or they'll disqualify me. If you broke a rule back then, let's say you could only, we meet up before the game, let's say with Chris and say, okay, like today, no punching in the face, just in the body, right? So we begin, and somebody in Chris' team punches me in the face. Well, he's not going to get a penalty. What's going to happen is that he waived the protection that this rule how this rule applied to his own team. So what happens is that if somebody breaks a rule, then everybody's allowed to break it. So if I get punched in the face, like, all right, you want to play that way? Like, okay, so it actually gives you an opportunity to change the game in a way. So it was very different, of course. So sports changed all that. So they were a concept that was alien to the rest of Europe at the time, until the 19th century. So you have French, Germans, writers who say that they had to borrow the word sport. Like we use sport in French, they use it in German, because according to them there was no equivalent in their language. A German writer commented that it was as hard to translate as the word gentleman for them. So that tells you a little bit about how of the revolutionary concept was. So, but what makes a sport a sport? So I'm going to tell you about another author, so Alan Goodman. So Alan Goodman is a sport historian, still alive. He produced some of the founding material in modern sports studies, and at least as far as history and sociology are concerned. And Goodman theory is, again, not accepted by all, but a lot of people use these criteria they came up with to define if something is a sport or not. So there are seven criteria. The first one is secularism. So sports are not played for a religious purpose, like the ancient Olympic Games, for example, played for a religious purpose, or the Aztec ball games. So those would not fit in as view of a sport. Equality. So sports seek to limit the disparity between players so that ideally only skill can determine the winner. So again, this is a very new concept in the 17th century. That's only, you're trying to narrow down the practice so that skill and not strength or mass can determine who's the winner. So in theory, everyone who has the skills to compete can join a sport, which wasn't always the case in pre-modern times, when class or ethnicity could be used for exclusion. So of course it's impossible to eliminate all inequality, as one opponent will always be faster or stronger, but this is why weight classes, for example, exist. You also have specialization. Specialization is that after a certain time, the rules of sport become so interiorized and ingrained that players begin to specialize their roles and have a team of experts helping them. So in hockey, for example, we have captains, defenders, allies, and the boxers will specialize in certain types of fighting. You'll have Olympic swimmers that have retinue of coaches, psychologists, other professionals who help them win, which are often specialized themselves in a certain school of thought. Also, another aspect that I find really interesting is the rationalization. So sport rules follow a logic of instrumentalization. For example, gymnasts no longer jump on a real animal, but rather on an kind of a makeshift horse, which has not much in common with the horse, really. Fencers, Olympic fencers, use weapons which have little in common, again, with the swords which they were supposed to imitate. Rules and regulation becomes a means to an end. So they're no longer a representation or a simulation of a real setting. Bureaucracy. Every level of sport today is bureaucratized. From children leagues to professional ones, ancient sport were rather controlled informally by the community or the church, for example. Quantification. So our modern world is obsessed with numbers and measurements, and it's difficult for us to imagine that in the ancient Olympics, disc throws, for example, wouldn't measure the distance that the other guy throw his disc. So that's very strange for us today because we're so obsessed with throwing the farthest. They were also not measuring, of course, running times. So time limits for combats were also completely absent. So a fight could last hours, nearly an entire day. So next step is the records. Modern sports are all about breaking the last record. So again, we have an obsession with this record breaking that comes from there, and it's in a way it's a reflection of our own society, where we always wish to strive for progress in every area of our lives, and records are then seen as a confirmation that the progress is being made, that we're getting stronger, we're getting faster, more intelligent, more efficient. So why do we seek to define what is sport and what it was? Well, it informs our debates. So many people would say, for example, that going down the roads of sports today is perfectly alright because in HEMA there were sports tournaments in the past, right? Well, why this is true for a part of the 19th century might not necessarily be the case for earlier forms of martial arts. And I want to precise something. I want to say that this is not a critique of HEMA as a sport, okay? But rather a call for perspective. So what we're doing is perfectly fine as long as we think about it. So now there were, of course, other types. Not everything was a game. There were other types of competitive fight. Present some of the other concepts which are used by various authors sometimes. So one of the first one is the absolute, often used today to refer about tourneys, padam, bohurt, etc. So were they sports? Some people say maybe, some people say no. So they combine, of course, aspects of our martial art, but are also quite rationalized in a way in their format. The goals are sometimes far removed from the realities of the battlefield. So knocking down an effigy, for example, hitting the armor instead of trying to defeat it. So the goal here is plaisance, as the French would say, so to have fun, to show off. That is acceptable to a point. In theory, it shouldn't be intentional. This is a major difference from one of its ancestors, which is agon, which I'm going to present in a minute. Then we also have combat games. So games were practiced often with very limited and flexible rules again. They were not expressly meant as a preparation or a simulation of war, even though they could provide useful training. They had no bureaucracy, of course, and many different variations again. So sometimes people say that absolutes can fall into games, but usually they're associated. Games are rather associated with the working and middle classes. For example, faction fighting, which is something I know very well about. So in Ireland, you had these games, as we could call them, called faction fights. So you had two or several factions that could meet and fight, mostly with rocks and sticks. Very often, death was involved. In fact, if someone was killed in a faction fight, if I broke somebody's skull with a stick, or if he's down and I just smash his skull while he's down and pleading for his life, if I end up in front of a judge, if somebody brings me there, the judge would often, in most cases, would dismiss the case, saying, well, it was a game. You guys were having fun, it was consensual, even though he was down, he was participating in that activity, and so it's perfectly fine. Some people were bringing to the court pieces of skull that they found on the ground to prove how brutal it was, and still the judge would say, no case. I'm not judging this thing. If you stab someone, though, oh, that was taboo. So stabbing someone in a faction fight would send you to prison because it was un-Irish. It was for the continental people to do this. And you had more or less the same thing happening all over Europe. It was very much documented in Ireland because they were one of the last culture to do this. But before that, up until the 18th century, you had Canis in Spain, which is very similar. Béhourt in France. So the French middle and lower classes were meeting up around Lent and fighting with sticks, sometimes to the death. Italians are bagordari, etc. So there are many other instances of this. But it mostly falls out of favor as sports become more mainstream and tolerance for violence goes down. Another example I'm showing here is the Morsi or Suri stick fighting called Danga. So they're duels fought with long staves, again with very little rules, sometimes resulting in death. One interesting thing you see here is that the guy here has equipment to protect himself, so it means that he's a really good fighter because he managed to get probably gifts from fans that gave him some protection in order to do the fight. Again, there's very little rules going on in those things, and the whole thing is controlled by the group around him. There's no real referee or anything. So the word game today has somewhat a pejorative connection because we associate this to child play. So for a lot of martial artists, if you say that what they do is a game, they'll look at you funny and maybe punch you in the face. So, but when you look, for example, at Irish faction fight, it's rather modern martial arts that look quite tame in comparison. So the last other concept I want to show you is called agon. So this is also Norbert Elias who came to use this terminology quite a lot. For him, agon is a term that was used to describe mostly the peculiar format of the ancient Olympic Games, namely pancration. So now modern Olympics, of course, have little to do with what the ancient format was like. rules were very limited, again, very flexible, but the most telling aspect in this is that in most instances, the games were meant not even as a simulation of war, but as an extension. So in pancreation, for example, death was relatively common, and even seen as a good thing. So if you died instead of summoning to your opponent, you would be exalted. So you would be, they would make statues of you, and they would say like, oh, look at how great this guy was. He died instead of summoning. So death was seen as a necessary thing because it prepared man for war. So it was, war is tough, people die. So our game, pancreation, is also war between different cities. Between different cultures, so of course people are going to die because it's war. War is cruel. So in some ways, you see the same argument in Renaissance fencing. There's a text in 1580 from Jean Papon, from a notary book. So he argues that death during fencing matches is a necessary evil because it is essential to prepare men to defend their country. So, of course, this feeling changed with time, but tells us how much different our contemporary practice is from, at least our contemporary view of this is different from what they were experiencing. So I want to come to another very main and contentious concept between HEMA, and that's the one I have difficulty pronouncing when I'm calling the name, and I'm telling about history. So now, history is another core concept, and there's this idea that the arts that we study and practice are historical. So for a lot of people, HEMA are first and foremost dead traditions recreated from surviving manuals. And it's alright if people hold this view, it's a viable definition, but I want to explore this logic further. So, is history only about documents? No. So, what do you think are other sources that historians work with? Other than manuals, books, documents? Sorry? Sculpture, yeah.
Illustration, art.
Illustration, yeah.
Recent things, oral history.
Oral history, yeah. Sorry, what?
Artifacts.
Artifacts, yeah. For archaeologists, mostly, yeah. So there's many different sources that we use to explore history, of course. So it's not only about documents. So people today use archaeological data, anthropological, or even oral history. So, and I want to put a special point about oral history. Without oral history, there would be a lot of things that we wouldn't know about. The problem is that our comprehension of history would be incomplete and biased because people did not have a chance to put their own history in writing. Not everyone had this chance. So a lot of what was documented is was actually made by the upper classes because they had access to writing, they had access to printing press, they had the time to do this. And the problem is that most of the time they were not interested in talking about everything that they saw. So they would talk about their own interests, of course. And they would also talk about, well, if they talked about things from other classes, it would be from their own viewpoint, their own values. And sometimes they might also change it. So you have Paulus Eckermer who present peasant weapons. Or one source I know well is Donald Walker from 1840, talks about shillelagh, for example. But we can ask ourselves how close was their own view, their own representation to the reality of these people. How much was modified by their outsiders' view or values. You know, maybe they said, well, I think these guys should be doing it this way. I think they should be doing it this way. So let's illustrate what I think is the right way to do it. So, and HEMA right now is very much positivist in its approach. Positivism is a 19th century concept that was developed by Auguste Comte, which seeks to make history more of a science. So it maintained that historians were to be really objective. So historians could be could aspire to objectivity, they could observe, deduce, cause, even make predictions about events. And today, a lot of historians reject this view. It's no longer believed that objectivity can be, or pure objectivity can be attained. And one important thing about Suppository is also it rejected oral history. Documents were really the hard facts that had to be studied. Oral history was unreliable. Was only to be used as folklore or stories. But today is considered a valuable source for historians and archaeologists. So, as I said earlier, it's very easy today to define what something isn't. If you ask people, they'll often define HEMA by putting it in contrast to what they think it isn't. Living, tradition, modern, sport. Personally, I don't think it's quite the right way to approach the problem, but to each their own opinion. Now, I talked a little bit about Elias. I won't go too much into it, but I really recommend you reading his theory about the process of civilization. His idea, as I said before, is that when bureaucratic institutions of democracy started to be developed, people started to reduce their tolerance towards violence. These institutions, as I said, were functioning mostly around debates, around rules, and affected how people viewed daily life, daily activities, and also those institutions took violence for themselves. They took a certain hegemony of violence. So in the days I'm showing you, so this is a bridge battle in Venice. It was kind of a faction fighting thing between West and East Venice. People would fight first with sticks, then as you can see here mostly with fists. People, losers would more or less fall down in the river and hopefully be recuperated by friends on the other side. Sometimes, as we can see on the lower right, it could also be used for disposing of enemies. So, you know, a couple of dead bodies floating in the river. Well, okay, well maybe they got killed during the bridge fight. You know, so it was a convenient way of killing adversaries without getting too much attention. But anyway, digressing. So as Elias was saying, he believed that the state took responsibility of violence, of policing, of warfare. It wasn't the duty of citizens anymore to bring people to justice, to make war unless you became a professional soldier. So this in turn made that the state was the state and the bureaucracy itself became much less tolerant of civilian violence. And so these things had to be controlled and relegated to police work, warfare. Now, let's get to some interesting stuff, some more modern issues. So, HEMA HIP, right? So now we get a lot of people sometimes joking about, HEMAists are the hipsters of martial arts, or at least of historical reconstructed martial arts. So, of course, the hipster today is a very much loaded subculture, perhaps more so than any others in the past. Few people would describe themselves as hipsters. Is anybody here a hipster, by the way? No, right? So, it makes sense because it's a culture that seeks to evade definition, the loathed mainstream. So, of course, it's very hard to define what is a hipster. And, of course, as people often say, if you feel the need to say that you're not a hipster, you probably are. So, a lot of the hate comes in a way from misunderstanding. The problem is that subcultures today are nearly instantly picked up by commercial fashion, and which makes it hard to recognize the actual subculture. At its core, being hipster is a rejection of modern technology-obsessed world So you see people wearing vintage clothes, getting interested in ancient trades, technology. So when I'm talking about, why am I talking to you about this? Well, because I find that there's some links between hipsters and HEMA. A lot of people say that HEMAists are the hipsters of the martial art world. Why? Because they're interested in old, outdated things, obsessed with authenticity, function along online communities, and put a lot of importance on about what they wear. Okay. So, but more seriously, the point I want to make is that while we're very much trying to recreate ancient traditions, HEMA is really a pure product of its time. So, just a couple of examples about how our modern view can sometimes influence what we perceive as being historical. So we're often told that we must put things into context in HEMA, right? And we should always be aware that we live in a very different world, of course, and that our values and culture will inevitably color our understanding of the past. One example I like to give is that of broaden. So broaden is a wrestling style from Brittany. Its practice goes back to the Middle Ages, but its use was used to be much more brutal. People would, again, it seems to come up often in my discussion today, but people would often die. Who would have guessed? So, and after the death of a famous wrestler in the 1930s, broaden came under much criticism. People were calling to ban the game, and many of its practitioners, including a Dr. Kodanek, came up with a series of reforms to kind of save broaden from being banned. Now, the reforms are not seen as an adaptation. What is very interesting about this is that they were seen as a renewal of old values. So Kodanek believed that if broaden had become so brutal was because that the noblemen had let it fall into the hands of commoners. What's important to know is that in the Middle Ages, both commoners and noblemen would practice broaden together. So they would often face each other during a wrestling match. And by the 17th century, 18th century, there was a saying that came up, said jeu de main, jeu de vilain. This means end game, commoner's game. So warfare was not about personal individual combat anymore, close quarters combat. It was about shooting somebody on the other side. So getting into wrestling with someone, getting into contact with someone was not seen as noble anymore. It was a commoner's thing. So the gentleman, the nobleman left broaden, and of course the peasants, the working men took up the practice for themselves. And Kodanek saw this as a corruption. So of course the pesky peasants were brutal and uncultured, took up the sport and make it brutal and kill people in the process. But actually when you would look at sources, we can see that it was brutal even back in the day when noblemen were practicing it. So the Kodanek's understanding of the past, understanding of modern values actually colored what they believe correct broaden should be. And he also instituted an oath. So we see those young girls here, they're making the oath before a broaden game, making an oath that they will play fair, that they will also honor their countries. So again, this was added very later, and it would have been completely alien to most broaden practitioner in the medieval age. Would never have sworn an oath of loyalty to a country, and to which fair play was a very alien concept again. So another example I like to give is small sword. Sometimes we look at small sword treatises and say that they're very tame, they're very, mostly the French ones, they don't really show dueling techniques or brutal things. you have to put this back into context again. In the 18th century, there were laws against dueling, very severe laws. If you were recognized guilty of dueling, what would happen is that first off, if you won, you would be condemned to death. Your family would lose its status. It would lose all its belongings. And if you lose, well, the same thing applied to your family. So if you survived, you would be also executed, and you would be, your family would be confiscated of all their status and belongings. So the official authorities were saying, oh, we've been very successful with dueling. You see that the numbers of dueling are going way down. But when you look at morgue reports, you can see that there's a lot of people who actually died from dueling, but the fact was hidden because families didn't want this to go out. And so if you were a fencing master and you're publishing a book, of course you're not going to be showing brutal dueling techniques, because then it would be like somebody today publishing a book about how to make a meth lab. You know, it wouldn't be very good for your social standing. So again, we have to, but if we're looking at this from a modern perspective, and I'm saying, well, I'm a very practical man, I like practical martial arts that show you how to deal with an opponent in a very efficient way. I look at the small sort of book and I'm like, well, no, they don't show what I expect to, so this must be why. So again, putting things into context is important. So going back to modern HEMA, participatory culture. If you ever heard the term before, but this is a modern concept that I think applies very well to HEMA. So this is an opposition to consumer culture. In this setting, ordinary people do not act simply as consumers, but as producers and contributors. There are certain groups that try to replicate old crafts, old dances, and of course old martial arts. And these communities follow certain trends, certain common trends. So there's the belief that one's creation matters. Of course, there has to be a feeling in the community that what you produce has value. In HEMA, there's an opportunity for non-academics to actually make interesting contribution to the field, to the study of historical martial arts. People translate, interpret, publish, teach. There's also low barriers, meaning that in regular martial arts, there are usually very rigid structure that will allow teachers to open groups, that will control what is being taught, what is being done in tournaments, etc. The same in academia, where the hierarchy stops many people from contributing. Now, you don't see this as much in HEMA today. Anyone can open up a club, start an event, interpret its own curriculum, and publish their research. There's also an informal mentorship. In many cases, groups do not have a clear instructor-student hierarchy. Any member of the group can teach if he has relevant material to share. The community at large will also act as mentors to new groups and instructors, helping them own their skills, but without the usual relationship of teacher-student. There's also a support for creating and sharing. There are many places, of course, to share sources, translation, videos, Wiktenauer, for example, and of course, an event like IGX is one of them. Social connection. It's probably one of the strongest things in HEMA. The social connections are made not only in a single club, but really all over the world. And there's a community which is made possible through the internet. So many participatory culture did not happen naturally. In order to develop it, it needed internet. A lot of people wonder why, for example, the early attempts at HEMA did not continue or not develop elsewhere. Well, they did not have this wonderful communication tool that we have today. And so, of course, there have always been people doing HEMA at one point or another since the 19th century. They were very isolated, did it on their own, finding a manual, trying a few things, having difficulty finding other people that were willing to participate with them. So today, this movement was simply meant to further stay underground. before internet happened and simplify things way more. Now, there's also a concept of authenticity, of course, in our practice. As I said earlier, hipster culture values a certain form of authenticity, and there's a very large drive today to seek what is authentic, what is seen as authentic. So, being an authentic fan of a music group, drink authentic tea, authentic beer, use authentic technology. But it's only an effect of our own culture, really. Many people are looking for the mythic authenticity to get out of a world that is perceived as being too artificial, too commercial. And HEMA is in a certain way a product of this culture as well. We're looking for a more authentic form of martial art than what is being proposed to us today. And so like many people, we turn to the past to seek alternatives. The question must be asked, is this interest always going to be so big? Will our culture change in ways that HEMA loses its appeal? Hard to say. Now, just for finishing, I wanted to make a point about living tradition. So some maintain a distance from it as they see themselves as being in opposition. I guess we come back to what HEMA isn't. Others can see links between the two worlds. Personally, I think that living traditions fall in a way into HEMA in a sense that they can offer a window into an historical practice. Since many of them are martial arts of the people, they also offer a perspective which is missing from most of our documents. This viewpoint I find often doesn't make sense for people who study mostly medieval Renaissance martial arts, but the closer you get to today, the more your practice intertwines with living traditions. For example, I practice Irish stick. There are sources about Irish stick, and I do a traditional martial art. People do catch-as-catch-can wrestling, sometimes with the same lineage as authors from the 19th century. So as you come closer to the day, that distinction between living and reconstructed becomes more fuzzy. An example I like to give is if I told you guys that this building here was built in 1700s, would you believe me? Probably not, right? So why won't you believe me? Probably because you look at this and it doesn't fit into your understanding of 1700s architecture. If I told you that this building was built in 2010, it would probably sound more relevant. If I told you that everything here dates from 2010, well, maybe not, right? Maybe some things are older, some things are more recent. Well, I like to see martial arts or historical martial arts the same way. They're all historical in a certain sense. They're all in a different state. So, like a house which needs to be renovated, which needs to be restored. Some houses have been modified through time, but they still maintain some parts of their original architecture. Some houses need to be reconstructed totally from plans or from our own research about how they look like. And I think it's going to be easier in the future to establish if a living tradition is representative of past techniques or not, as our understanding of historical martial art grows. The same thing for buildings. If you have no understanding of 1700s architecture, of course I could tell you that this is 1700 building. You would know the difference. But because our understanding of historical architecture has progressed so much, now we can say, like, okay, that really doesn't fit. This other building fits. So as the field of martial arts and history of martial arts will progress, I hope that it's going to be easier to link living traditions and historical documented practices. And, well, I don't know if we'll have the chance to do it, but I wanted to make maybe a reflection with you guys about the future of HEMA practice. So one thing that a lot of sociologists say is that in sport, things inevitably become more bureaucratized, things inevitably become more commercial. So is it something that HEMA is bound to do? Is it something that we can change? This is a tournament that was one of the first, at least I consider one of the first HEMA tournaments that was done in Montreal in 1889. Back then, people were still arguing about how to make rules of fencing more realistic in certain ways. And a couple of generations later, this completely fell out the window. Same thing with karate. People had all these techniques from karate. They were saying, okay, this is how we do karate because it's efficient. A couple of generations later, people changed it to become more entertaining, more simple to practice, to judge. So what we believe today is HEMA might not be shared by the next generations. So I think it's important to have discussions about this so that we can at least decide where things are going in a way. So that's mostly it for our presentation. Thank you guys for sticking around. Hope you liked it. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.
I should mention that at this juncture, we're going to have a roundtable discussion. We only have about 14 more minutes, so I think that's how we're going to.
Okay.
I think I saw Renier come up to participate, but then
Yeah.
poof. Okay.
Yeah.
But at this juncture, I mean, does anybody in the crowd have any ideas, thoughts, opinions?
I think a lot of it's not really going to be under our control. I mean, we can have every discussion we want about what we want the next generation to do, but it's not up to us.
Oh, absolutely not. But I think if we make this really part of what we think HEMA is, that HEMA is a reconstruction of how people fought in the past. If we make this clear in our definition of what it is, then people will maybe think about it a little bit more. If we just say it's fighting with swords, then maybe not. So, no.
I think different groups also fall in between those 2 points. So there's groups that are very, very focused on making sure what they do not only works but is historical. And there's groups where, to them, a manual is really just a collection of things that might work in bouting.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like, the bell curve, at one end there's the historic reenactors that they wear the proper shoes, the proper everything, and at the other end there's almost the sport aspect of it. And, most groups, even individuals within most groups, are somewhere in between there.
Yeah, it's very valid. You guys have any other ideas?
Michael, please say something inflammatory.
No, I know the inflammatory side.
All right.
Where's Michael Chittister?
Well, for example, what do you think is the place of living traditions as far as HEMA is concerned? Is it only frog DNA? Is it HEMA? Is it going to be part of HEMA club practice?
Not to split hairs, seriously, because semantics gets very old and very boring after a while. But
Yeah.
we do need to agree on some sort of terminology.
Yeah.
And I'd love to talk to you about what you were saying about historical later over
Yeah.
here. Would be great.
Absolutely.
But for
If
example,
you're not going to say anything inflammatory, either.
I'm sure. Trying to be polite. There's another term kicking around, Western martial arts. And so for me, I just got really comfortable kicking into an idea that historical European martial arts does really rely on Europe America. But it's a subset of Western martial arts, which is an overarching broader view.
Yeah.
And in that context, living traditions can definitely be part of Western martial arts, though they might not be part of HEMA. And I think it's about how much we want to invest in certain words or terms. Like if we're like, no, what I do is HEMA, and I don't care about most, then it's like, well, do we really need to care? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think we'd all agree that living traditions are definitely Western, Western origin.
Yeah.
Then we can quibble with whether the historical is like purely the right record. That's
Yeah.
okay.
I respect that view, and for me, I find that living lineages are part of our oral history. That's part of our intangible heritage, and I think they can have depends if they have historical relevance, if they can allow you to study in a way historical practices.
Once again, I actually think we agree. And we're splitting hairs over the word history.
Yeah.
Because I think disciplines like archaeology and anthropology, etc., they definitely inform history. They're useful in inquiry part of the historical-based process. And it's just whether is that pure definition of history? And there, is it really useful to quibble? Do I think oral history is useful? Do I think the Norse sagas are useful? Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
But at what point is it historical, based on some sort of recorded method, and at what point is it purely speculative? Like,
Absolutely.
I have a friend who does Viking.
Yeah.
He recreates Viking combat. How? Speculation. It's cool. It's fun. It's an archaeological experiment.
Yeah.
Am I going to tell him about that fun? No. Might I sort of like, hey, let's talk a little bit about whether it should be called historical. As a fun intellectual exercise? Sure.
Yeah.
Does it matter? Probably not.
I think those debates, those things are going to become easier once our understanding of historical martial arts become more complete.
Well, and to some extent, it's all going to be points on a spectrum anyways, because even no matter how many written records we have, there's still an element of speculation that's going to be involved.
Absolutely.
And so it's a question of, there's no way to quantitatively define how much speculation is okay, to keep it historical, and how much is, or on the other end, how concrete a historical source has to be a valid historical source, because the sagas, are they a historical source? That's an argument that you could have all day, because they're a historical document of some sort. But what does it have to be to become a proper historical or a valid HEMA source? I don't know the answer to that either.
Well, I think...
And I can postulate lots of potential definitions, and I do online all the time. But ultimately, it's like lots of opinions that we can express. That there's not any, because there's so many gray areas in between each point. But I think it's useful to keep asking this question to keep us all on task. But I don't think we should expect to ever find the right answer to it.
I also think it depends on how much people are invested in the fact that what they're doing is HEMA. I mean, some people have a club that does a whole bunch of things they find interesting, some of which we might call HEMA, some of which are actually something totally different.
Well,
They
and
just like
that's
doing
partly
it.
because HEMA now is an identity and it's a culture, so they want to be part of what the thing HEMA is, even if their actual activities day to day wouldn't be considered HEMA. They want to be part of this thing that we're calling HEMA. So, and that's an important social thing that's completely separate from what we can say about history or anything else, right?
Yeah, but some of the things,
They
I'm
like
talking about
HEMA,
where
they
some of
like-
the things they're doing are HEMA, but other things are not.
Well, sure, and then that too. So I don't think you can say, how much time do you have to spend on a recognized HEMA activity to be doing HEMA? I mean, what's the answer to that?
No, like you said, I think there's definitely it's a subculture. Like HEMA is this thing that's been centered around manuals for so long, and it's a valid view.
But that's why I'm not going to be inflammatory, because I know that it's all opinions here.
You're just saying that. 'cause
Over a
you're-
beer later, though.
You're just saying that because you're on camera. Okay.
Am I? I tried to avoid the camera.
Right there, big guy.
I don't want to get my soul stolen.
I didn't know you were Amish.
Phil Frisbee's been teaching me.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting discussion and raised some very, very valid questions.
No problem. I kind of shooted in all different directions today. I just wanted to give some food for thought.
Right, well,
People.
your history of sport actually was really interesting to me as well, and different ideas of what a sport was.
I had read an article on that distinction of like the older game concept and the modern sport concept just recently. In fact, that might have been on your blog. And then it was a real eye-opener for me, because you just assume that this concept that we have now was present in the past, and then to see like, well, they didn't even think of it that way at all. You know?
Yeah, no, again, putting things back into context and thinking about our own perception as 21st century people, and how much of it we project on people in the past.
You know, you could say that about the word martial art too. Because if you're talking about people playing a game on a stage in medieval Germany of trying to hit each other in the head with a longsword and draw blood, they probably weren't thinking of that as what we think of as martial arts practice any more than what we think of as sport.
All right, well,
We played fun.
yeah, thanks everyone.
lecture. It's very interesting.
Ah, no problem. So, we can discuss it more
Yeah, we
later.
can. Sure, we'll never stop discussing it.
It'd be really interesting to me to think like, what if I met someone that had a living significant age that was from Scotland and could be proven to go back to the
I
home,
actually have an answer to your question.
and it was substantially different somehow from what I did. Would I change what I was doing or not? I don't even know.
It's usually like when you do things that are really.
Well, I mean, but you can write the definition and say, well, it must be a text that was designed to teach
Like
fencing.
the
But
limits kind of.
There are a
like
lot of
there's-
texts that it's not
and,
clear if they really are. And then it still becomes a judgment call. In your opinion, is this
Yeah, this
particular
modern
manuscript
way
designed to be a
of
teaching
thought,
aid?
no.
Or what about a
Breaks
student's
the
notes
second
about
aid.
the lesson
But
instruction
now
you
there's a
receive?
movement
Is that
that
counted
they
as
want to
something like-
take. their
We have
own
enough fencing
concepts
manuals
with-
now
with
that there's a
historical
lot of
manuals
weird
and
variety.
kind of
Big
trying to
thing to show up.
recreate from this. the
Especially in the
original
shorter or
practice.
more
So,
fragmentary sources.
that even
There's valuable instruction, like digital instruction,
living
but
lineage
it's
is
mixed
part
into
of
all
it.
kinds
I
of
would say
weird
it's
stuff.
those manuals.
But then again, like I don't
Makes the
identify
document
different-
itself.
I
defy
identify as a processor
classification
fencer. That's how I think of myself. And the family I
It's an
see what I do.
angel.
Which is why I'm willing to be
is
comfortable with
sort of
ambiguity here, as much as I'm
No,
not
the
arguing
fact
about
that
it.
it's
People
European.
just create
Like
conversation.
it matters to me that it's Scottish because I like Scottish history.
I don't think the site
It doesn't matter to me that it's
Personally.
European.
Same way.
And so like that's
But
a
then
little
again,
also
it's like, what
disconnect
is-
I mean, but I
for me
mean,
with the
it's
Igbo
not a
world,
very
because I
good
would
bargaining
be
process.
just as
It's
interested in
weird,
being
so.
at a